That was an excellent segue into our little change of theme for the afternoon. So we've got 2 more presentations before afternoon tea. The next one is from Professor Steve Hopper. Steve doesn't really need an introduction, but I'll read it anyway. Over 50 years as a conservation biologist and teacher, Steve Hopper led as Director of Kings Park and Botanic Gardens and the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in the UK. Today, Steve's research focuses on sustainable living with biodiversity, especially with Aboriginal elders. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks very much, Jen. I'll try and make this quick because I'm second but last between you and afternoon tea. And the nature of the talk is one about trying to make a contribution towards a general theory of threatened species and endemism, particularly in the southern hemisphere. I had this slide up on my other talk, so I won't dwell on it other than to say after 10 years of surveying threatened plants in Western Australia, we found this interesting trend where 2/3 of the well-surveyed threatened plants were confined to what we call uplands, very subdued uplands as you can see, and only 10% were down along river valleys and along the beach. And places like that, and about a quarter in between. So something special was going on in these uplands. And what was it? A number of people have tried to interpret the southwest Australian flora and why it's rich from a univariate point of view. So it's the soil, or it's the sand, or it's the fertility. And every time people have attempted this, it's very easy to falsify univariate hypotheses. It became clear that a multivariate hypothesis was needed, and bivariate attempts didn't quite work either. So in the end, we settled on the hypothesis that it's 3 things combined which go towards making these places incredibly rich in endemism and threatened species. Old landscapes, and by that I mean tens of millions of years old usually, above oceans at maximum glacial sea level, so that's the little map on the bottom line there, that's a reconstruction of the Earth 90 million years ago. And the really interesting thing to notice there is look at the southern hemisphere, and you can pretty well recognise the continents as we know them today. India's in a bit of a funny position, but apart from that, South America, Africa and Australia, Antarctica are very clearly identifiable, which means their coastlines existed at this point in time at the highest of sea levels. Look at the northern hemisphere and I struggle to recognise anything. That's been a place of incredible geological diversity since 90 million years ago, nowhere near as geologically stable as the southern hemisphere. Hence the climatically buffering idea is as the second idea, that is proximity to oceans buffers climate. Fairly well understood maxim. Australia, it applies most places on Earth. And finally, if you persist as a landscape above water without major geological upheaval, then rainfall will eventually weather out all the nutrients you've got, and you'll end up with mineral sand if it's a sandstone or granite underlying bedrock. And that's a phosphorus limited soil type, not a nitrogen limited soil type. So in developing the body of theory that was published in 2009, I looked at 3 regions: the southwest of Australia, the Pantapui region in South America, straddling the equator, parts of Brazil and Venezuela, for example, and the Greater Cape Floristic region of South Africa, and used them as the model areas to set up a bigger model. Since then, the Brazilians have taken on this body of theory and gone pretty crazy. In fact, more work on old landscapes now occurs in Brazil than any other country on Earth. So they found it useful. how do you recognise these things? You have to realise that each of those regions I alluded to are not single OCBILs. An OCBIL is a landscape, and it's usually surrounded by younger landscapes. So the very top photo there shows a mesa landform inland from Geraldton in Western Australia. The flat tops are old landscapes. They're the slowest eroding parts of the landscape, but the edges, those steep, what we call breakaways, are young landscapes. So here you've got an old landscape and a young landscape side by side. And that's the take-home message. The next photo below that is of Table Mountain, South Africa, classic OCBIL. And the cartoon in the middle there just shows you with the green lines where the older landscapes are and where the younger landscapes are, what I call yodfals, or young, often disturbed and fertile landscapes. So you can see this complex juxtaposition of the two, and this is terrific for ecologists and for people interested in hiking and all that, because you can walk from one to the other and over a few metres quite often, and the body of predictions that I'll present to you may well apply. These are fundamentally different communities. In mountainous country, the Stirling Range in the bottom left there is what I use to illustrate. It's the hilltops, the ridge lines, the hilltops, and occasionally plateau-like foothills that form the older parts of the landscape that are the slowest eroding, and I would call them OCBILs. What we've discovered is we started out with 3 regions of the Earth where these landscapes occur. We now know that about half of the world's global biodiversity hotspots have them, and there's incoming research material now from many places where people are working on this. A few are in the Northern Hemisphere. There's even old landscapes in California, in the Sierra Nevada, for example. Certainly the southeast North American coastal plain. The Mediterranean basin has old landscapes, and India, of course, but the lion's share are Southern Hemisphere. And that's really important because where do most people live? In the Northern Hemisphere. What happened to the Northern Hemisphere in the last a million years or so is under ice just 12,000 years ago. Where was the ice in the Southern Hemisphere? Confined to relatively few areas of tall mountains. Most of the land was not under ice. And from that simple observation comes this. So I'll test you all on this before you have your cup of coffee. We've been able to develop a series of 12 biological, ecological, evolutionary hypotheses in blue, and 12 conservation management hypotheses in grey. And these are set up as predictions, going back to square one and saying, well, if this is a landscape that's been around for tens of millions of years, how would you expect natural selection to operate on plants and animals, particularly sedentary animals, those that don't move around much? And the very first hypothesis in blue is reduced dispersibility. These are not places like in the Northern Hemisphere where if you can move around large distances quickly, you inherit the Earth. In old landscapes that are continuously exposed to the weather and have not been under ice since the Permian, the worst possible thing you could do is move around. The best and safest strategy is to wait, if you're a plant, is to wait for mum to die and grow up exactly where she is. Because you know that's a tried and true place for your species and your adaptations. So hence the reduced dispersibility idea. That's fundamental to a lot of what follows. Increased local endemism flows from that. Common rarity, so being rare and localised in isolated patches is the common situation. Accentuated persistence of old lineages is also an opportunity that these ancient landscapes provide. And you can work your way down and there's a series of other ideas I won't go into now, other than to talk about number 12, which is that First Nations revere sacred uplands. So this is a hypothesis that has emerged predominantly from Australian studies with Aboriginal people. And in terms of what you do with these places, the number one thing that you could do usefully as a conservation biologist is don't mess with them. just don't touch them. These are places that have been put together over tens of millions of years. They're like the Mona Lisa of the biological world. They've been assembled through evolution over incredible periods of time, and to pretend that we understand the way these communities work and have the knowledge and finesse to actually try and mess with them and fix and repair them is a bit over the top, in my humble opinion. If you want to do restoration, go to the young landscapes, go to the river margins, go to the lake margins, work the coastlines. They're the places where it's dead easy and you'll get a result within 2 or 3 years and things will look really great. These places, no one has a clue how to put together granite outcrop communities in Western Australia, nor in the world. I still haven't read a paper that convinces me that people have cracked it. There's all sorts of other heretical statements in the management, and I see the 5 fingers have been given me, so I'll move on. I just want to emphasise this point of unexpected findings. So yesterday in the genetics we heard, for example, of the isolation by distance model in classic population genetics. That simply means the further apart you go, get populations in a species, the more genetically divergent they should be. We tested that idea and others with this banksia in southwestern Australia. It has about a 300 or 400 kilometre range, and it has 2 subspecies, one shown in orange and one in blue. And if you look very, very carefully, the blue stuff is down near a town called Walpole, and it's a tiny little area just 25 kilometres east-west. So the hypothesis would be that that subspecies in the tiny little area should have less variation than the orange dots, which are up to 300 or 400 kilometres apart, if isolation by distance applies. When you look up at the top left there's genetic space with DNA markers, and it's the complete converse of that prediction. The orange subspecies, which is spread out in geographical space, has far less genetic variation than the species spread over 25 kilometres. Complete converse. And the more we look at the genetics, the population biology, the reproductive biology, we've just have to toss out what the textbooks tell you and start again. It's very exciting. I urge my students, if you want to discover new biological phenomena, go to these old landscapes, because they're just magic. They're full of all sorts of stuff. And I'll be a bit even more heretical now and suggest to you that a fundamental maxim, if you read the textbooks and the popular books that come out, is, of course, the Australian flora and fauna came out of rainforest, right? Gondwana and rainforest, all that. When you start looking at molecular phylogeny, and if you assume niche conservatism, that the niches haven't changed through phylogeny, then in the birds, the birds that are down the bottom end of the evolutionary tree are things like noisy scrub birds, which occurs in heathland and thick peat swamps in Western Australia. The eastern scrub bird, it gets into a bit of rainforest over here. But if you work your way down that phylogeny, you'll find that most of the lineages, at least of the birds, have representatives from old, what are now sclerophyll landscapes, and not from rainforests. So I'm making the timid suggestion here that maybe some of our bird phylogenetic interpretation needs to be flipped on its head. Eucalypt certainly does, and you in southeast Queensland here have this wonderful little thing, it's a mallee called Eucalyptus curtisii. That's sister to all other eucalypts within the strict genus Eucalyptus, sister to it. And that occurs on sandstone outcrops, just like we saw in the talk before this one. It's nowhere near rainforest. So maybe mallees, I remember as a student reading Nancy Burbage's hypothesis that mallees are really modern forms, and in actual fact this is suggesting that mallees have been around for the best part of 50 to 60 million years. So a lot of fun. Reinterpreting phylogenies of all sorts of organisms is possible, and gaining the evidence, of course, is the challenge that faces us. So there's a few papers here that have come out. There's a special issue in the Biological Journal of the Linnaean Society in which these two papers appeared, and I've had a go at the eucalypts and reinterpreting them from this perspective. We also reconfigured the body of theory, and in 2023 published a paper on endemism in Mediterranean climate regions. The last thing I wanted to point out was just with Aboriginal people, we've now got the best part of 10 years intensive field work under human ethics obligations, of course, working with families where the elders were concerned they were going to pass on, and their knowledge was going to pass on with them, and asking if they would like us to record on videotape their stories on country. And we've done that, and started with Alison Lolfitz's PhD, and two very clear divisions of landscape emerged from her work, and they are what the Noongars call Bilia and Cart or Yield. Bilia are lake margins and freshwater lake, but it's also the word for breast milk, human breast milk. Cart is their word for the human head, but also for hilltops. And straight away they recognised that the granite hilltops as being different from this stuff. So it took a microsecond to work out that they were talking about the same stuff I've just been talking to you about, old versus young landscapes. And why is that important? Well, when we asked them what did they do in the young landscapes shown in green here, that's where camping, burning, hunting for game, gathering plant resources occurred. There was high importance placed on spirits in the water, but by and large everyday activities occurred low in the landscape with regular relative disturbance high. Up on the rocks, no Noongar in their right mind would camp on a granite. So they're inspirited, and they deserve the utmost reverence. Burning, almost never. Hunting, maybe a little bit. Gathering plant resources, sometimes. But these are really important creation spaces, storyline places, and often associated with access restrictions for gender and age. So for the last 4 years, we've done a project called Walking Together, and that's involved going to 660 sites shown in red on the map and recording close to 2,000 videotape conversations, transcribing them, handing them back to the families, and then asking the families, would you like to collaborate in writing them up with you as first authors? And various PhD students have been operating. Susie Cramp worked on lizard traps, slabs of granite propped up by a prop stone that is really important in some Noongar families. Aboriginal scale burning is shown on the right there. It's a familiar story Australia-wide, I think. It's controlled and never takes out the trees. And working on culturally modified trees as well has been something that Anna Arshenko has worked on, finding a rare plant while she's doing it. So that's it. Basically all I wanted to say was there's a bit of evidence for most of these hypotheses for Australian threatened flora, but a lot more work needs to be done.